Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining on this joint event co-hosted by Chatham House, Tsinghua University, and also University of Oxford. This event is also a part of the London Climate Action Week 2021. And the topic today we are discussing is a new perspective on decarbonizing the global energy system and its implication for China. As you may know that in the September of last year, China announced its new target to achieve the carbon neutrality before 2060 and also to peak China's emission before 2030. And this has injected a momentum to the global climate governance. And also that we are approaching the COP26 at the end of this year, which is going to be also another very critical moment for the process of global climate governance. And by seeing that UK and China together to initiate a research project on the climate risk. And one of the achievements of this joint research is, especially this phase 3, is the report we are going to present today, named as the new perspective on decarbonization, decarbonizing the global energy system and its implication for China. And in this report, the Oxford team, together with Tsinghua team, present a new and simple and transparent model. And based on this model, this study suggests that if the generation cost of renewable energy can be reduced further in the next decades, and also if the growth rate of renewable energy can continue the current trend in the next decades, then the world still has a chance to achieve the temperature goal under the Paris Agreement, and also to control the global temperature rise within the 2 degree. So that is the major findings from this report, and we will have this opportunity to have my colleagues from both Chinese side and UK side to present not only this report, but also some other ongoing research findings to the participants. So by saying that, I will also introduce briefly the structure of today's workshop. We will have 2 parts. In the first part, we will have 4 main topic, 4 main speakers to discuss this report and also some other ongoing research. And then it will followed by a panel discussion, and we will have 5 panelists from different organizations that provide their insights. So by saying that, I would like to start firstly the first part, and I would like to invite Professor Dodadi from the expert panel on climate change of China State Council to present his views on the progress of China's carbon neutrality target. Professor Dodadi, you have the floor, and I will share the screen.
Good afternoon and good evening. I will give the presentation in Chinese. So can I see the PPT?
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, this paper is in Chinese, but I think we have. 对，我们有 我们有很好的这个中英翻译的这个。
But I think although this PPT is in Mandarin, but we have simultaneous interpretation, so I will speak Mandarin. I want to say that although China has made a lot of progress in low carbon development, for example, in areas of energy conservation and emission reduction, the reduction of carbon intensity per capita GDP, per unit GDP, China has made huge efforts. And the wind power, solar power, hydropower, nuclear power, and also other non-fossil fuel energy has developed very fast in China. And also at the same time, in sectors like transportation, we see that the electric vehicle is also developing very fast, but these are already something that happened in the past. In China, we have the target of 2030 and 2060. So we have these two very important targets already. And based in this kind of context, I want to say that China has initiated a complete new phase of different actions to speed up China's development of low carbon growth. We know that this year is the first year of China's 14th five-year plan period. So we not only stress continued economic developments, but also that we have to realize high quality growth. So we need to prioritize innovation, coordination, green, open, and shared growth. So these are the key concepts for the new kind of a growth in China. And China will also see growth based on people's needs. And we know, or we understand that in this new development period, a green development so in the past was concentrated on the control of conventional pollution sources, and it was also on the efforts to improve the cleanness of the air and water, etc. But currently, we prioritize the efforts to transform to low carbon and zero carbon emission. This has been a top priority on the government agenda. So we are having the low carbon transformation to lead China's efforts in controlling pollution and green development. Of course, low carbon development and transformation is also very important content of the new development concept featuring innovation, coordination, green opening, and sharing. During the 14th five-year plan period, as the central government's documents has made it very clear, so during the 14th five-year plan period, our eco-civilization will prioritize carbon emission reduction. We will promote a green transformation of economic and social development, and the eco-environment will be in the critical period to prioritize the quality instead of the quantity. So in the new period of development, how can we realize the win-win of green development and economic development? This is key. And in the green development, the low carbon development and carbon neutrality has already been a leading target. And China, actually, we have a special system concerning political motivation. And Chinese President Xi Jinping, on behalf of the central government, has stressed for a number of times concerning the target setting and the efforts to implement different actions. He has required different governments, the different enterprises, the different organizations, and also the research institutes, the different kind of requirements to achieve the two major targets. So from the government perspective, we have established a leading group to achieve the carbon neutrality.
There is a double carbon leadership group led by the Vice Mayor Han Zheng. And we have the leaders from NDRC and many other ministries working as the vice chairman of this leadership group. This leadership group is the leading organization in charge of the implementation of the double carbon goals. And the governors of different provinces are the leaders for the realization of the carbon peaking and the carbon neutrality goals. And all the big enterprises, industries, sectors, including technology, industry, finance, and the investment sector are developing their own action plans for the realization of carbon peaking and the carbon neutrality goals. This is unprecedented. The low carbon activities and actions in China were not based upon different sectors, but now all sectors and industries are fully mobilized to work towards the achievement of the double carbon goals. So this is unprecedented mobilization mechanism. This mechanism will make our low carbon transition and the double carbon move a great success. China is a huge country. For these double carbon targets, dramatic changes will have to happen. We have to change our energy supply system, energy production, and the consumption system. There will be a lot of different paths for the realization of carbon neutrality. A lot of discussions and researches on that are underway. People are studying the specific technical roadmaps, and many discussions and researches are being taken. But in some sectors and industries, they have some defined actions and measures. First of all, we have to save energy and reduce energy consumption. That's one consensus. In China, we stress the control of total energy consumption, and we have to reduce energy intensity. Across China, a major energy saving and highly efficient low carbon technologies and projects must be implemented. In the past 5 years, there was adequate supply of energy in China, and we relaxed our efforts in energy saving and consumption reduction. But now, with these double carbon goals, we have stressed the importance of energy saving and consumption reduction. The momentum for energy saving will be resumed. And second, to realize the carbon peaking target, highly energy consuming and high emitting industries must be put under control. They shall be banned from expansion in many places and regions. Those high energy consuming and high emitting projects are eliminated from the project list. In some places, 75% of those projects are eliminated. This is an important measure for industrial restructuring and low carbon transition. And these measures will matter a lot for the achievement of our carbon peaking target and restricting the expansion of high energy consuming and emitting enterprises. According to President Xi Jinping, by 2030, for solar power and wind power, we have to expand the capacity, reaching about 1.2 billion kilowatt hour. And every year, we have about 120 million kilowatts new installed capacity of solar PV. So we may surpass the target of 1.2 billion kilowatt solar PV target, and we may reach 1.6 billion and more kilowatts of installed capacity of solar PV. And for hydropower and nuclear power, they are developing rapidly. In particular, we enjoy higher safety and security in nuclear power technology. And nuclear power may recover to the level before the Fukushima incident. Nuclear power industry may enjoy a relatively high growth period. Another measure that has been taken is to electrify transportation and mobility. In particular, the Chinese government is encouraging the development of new energy vehicles, NEVs. It is possible that before 2030, the new car sales will be dominated by electrical vehicles. Currently, the new car sales are dominated by ICE vehicles, and before 2030, the new car sales might be dominated by NEVs, electrical vehicles. At the same time, the NEV charging stations will be built, including the V2G system. Support will be given to the electrification of vehicles. The power system will move towards low carbon. And vehicle batteries and fuel cells are now entering into competitive high growth period. China is leading the development of batteries and fuel cells and hydrogen generation. And of course, we are facing with many challenges. We have to further study how to find alternative fuel for waterway transportation and aviation fuel. This is one major challenge. Of course, electrification of vehicles will not only lead to low carbon development. We have to develop intelligent vehicles and to develop autonomous driving. In the future, for the development of transportation, mobility consumption must be more rational, and the operation of our mobility system must be featured by high efficiency and low carbon. In addition, we have to pursue low carbon development in the building and the construction industry. The development directions have been clarified. First of all, energy efficient and low energy consuming buildings will be built. The new buildings will adopt super low energy consumption standards. The energy consumption in buildings must be reduced, including the energy consumption for heating and electrical appliances. The heating system that burns fossil fuel or uses industrial waste heat must be converted into the system that uses heat pump. We have to reduce energy consumption in buildings. At the same time, the total floor area of construction will be put under control. 2 billion square meters of floor area is being built in China. We have to guide the expansion of the building floor area. At the same time, electrification must be pursued in the buildings. And there will be integrated development between green building construction and the utilization of renewable energy and the construction of charging and discharging facilities for NEVs and DC power utilization, etc. The super low energy consuming buildings must be built first. That's the first step. In the future, 20 to 30 years, for the existing heating system that burns coal or natural gas must be retrofitted. There have been a lot of ideas and measures for low carbon development in various sectors and industries. The power system is now discussing how to realize low carbon development before the agreed schedule or timetable by the Chinese government. As I mentioned, we have to further accelerate the development of non-fossil fuel energy, in particular renewable energy. We have to further enhance the percentage of non-fossil fuel in power generation. The power system must be featured by the utilization of renewable energy. But of course, China's economy is still developing at a high speed. In the transition process, we have to guarantee the safety of the power system, and coal-fired power plants must be phased out at a lower cost. And there is a strict control over new construction of nuclear power stations. The coal-fired power plants must be phased out. They shall not dominate our power generation system. The coal-fired power plants must support the development of renewable energy. When there is undersupply of power from renewable energy, the coal-fired power plants can play a supportive role. So we have to try to realize net zero in the power system. For the industry to realize net zero, the power system must realize net zero first. It may take about 10 years to develop innovative technologies and conduct demonstrative projects for the upgrading of industrial boilers. And then in 15 to 20 years, the whole industrial system in China will accelerate its path towards net zero. Of course, in that process, more technical innovation is needed, including the generation of green hydrogen, the development of energy storage, the development of alternative fuel, and zero carbon composite materials, as well as CCS. We can use biomass to generate energy, and we have to install CCS in many facilities. China is now devising its path towards low carbon transition in a systematic manner. Comprehensive actions are being developed and designed. We want to peak our carbon emission ahead of the schedule, and in that process, we want to develop low carbon technologies and get them utilized. We have to get technically prepared for the low carbon transition in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fu. Thank you, Professor Zhou, for this very comprehensive introduction on the carbon's neutrality, on China's carbon neutrality target. And our next speaker is Dr. Matthew Eavis. He is the senior researcher of Oxford Martin Post Carbon Transition Program, and he will present the major findings from the report of a new perspective on decarbonizing the global energy system and its implication for China. You have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Teng Fei and Professor Zhao for your introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us. I assume you can see my slides. Please let me know if you can't. As Professor Tang has just said, I am presenting the work that we put together for this Chatham House project that's funded through the Foreign Office. And it's a piece of work that was put together by my myself and my colleagues at Oxford, as well as Professor Teng Fei's team at Tsinghua University. What I'll be presenting is actually very similar to what's in the report. So I'll be looking at what policymakers are being told about climate mitigation and the costs of meeting the Paris goals, what we think might be wrong with that story, whether we think there is a better perspective on that story, and some conclusions. So this is a picture that's possibly familiar to a lot of you. It presents our current emissions in the black line, progressing from 1980 up to 2020, up to global emissions of around 40 gigatons of CO2 in the present day, and some projections into the future that if we continue on that sort of path, we get into high levels of global warming above pre-industrial levels, which the physicists will tell us is quite catastrophic. And if we are able to turn this ship around and reduce our emissions very rapidly, by the end of the century, we could hope to achieve the Paris goals, which is on the bottom of the graph there, of meeting 1.5 or less than 2 degrees warming. We don't have a problem with this. It's very important that policymakers understand the uncertainty involved in dealing with climate change and our own emissions. Our problem really has to do with what the IPCC and major mitigation models tell us will have to be done in order to achieve those less than 2 degree targets. One of which is that economic growth could suffer, that obviously if you reduce economic growth, you could also reduce emissions. So that is one way to reduce emissions. Another way to reduce emissions is to reduce our energy usage. Fairly obvious. And if we are able to do a fair amount of that, that is not necessarily going to get us to the Paris Agreement. So we are going to require us to build quite a lot of what is called carbon capture and storage, 13 gigatons by 2100 in one of the most ambitious IPCC scenarios. Because that is an added cost on our energy system, that also means electricity prices are likely to be higher. Now, what is carbon capture and storage? It is a big piece of engineering that you add on to your power plant or your emitting plant. You capture the CO2 as it comes out of the flue. You concentrate it and you purify it and stick it underground, basically, and hope that it stays there for a very long time. To do that, you require additional energy. You also require additional water for cooling, and it's currently a very expensive piece of technology. And how much of that are we going to need in order to meet the Paris goals according to these climate models? Well, there's a plant in Canada that sequesters about 1 million tons of CO2 per year. In order to meet that ambitious goal, we would have to build one of these every 3 days for the next 80 years. As you can see, it's not a small piece of engineering. So that is quite a challenge. And if we are to maintain our economic growth and not reduce that at all, we would have to build about one a day for the next 80 years. Now, not even the cheerleaders of carbon capture and storage think we're going to be able to achieve such large numbers of installments of this technology. They believe that we're probably only going to be able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 9% through this technology. So what's wrong with this story, apart from the obvious that it seems like an almost impossible task? One problem is that the models that are being used to determine these requirements and give the advice to policymakers are based on models that use cost projections that are consistently biased to be underreport the future projections of actual costs of some very important technologies, one of which I'm showing here, which is solar PV. This is the projections from the International Energy Agency through time, starting in 2001 in the yellow line, against the black line, which is the actual PV costs coming down through time. This is on a logarithmic scale, up into the present day, we're in the purple. And you can see there that there is a consistent bias in the projections of underestimating the declines in costs of solar PV. If this was purely random in terms of chance, you would see some of those lines on the left-hand side of that black line. So there's obviously a systemic bias in their projections. Being able to project future technology costs is not an easy thing to do. One particularly difficult component of it is there is a positive feedback dynamic. If costs do come down, that could lead to more deployment. And because we learn every time we install new technology and every time we manufacture more, that can lead to declines in costs. And because we find that more deployment leads to more declines in costs, more costs leads to more demand, declines lead to more demand increases, more deployment increases lead to more cost declines. You've got a positive feedback dynamic there. And that is why on the left-hand side, that's in a logarithmic scale, and it looks like it is going down in a linear fashion on a logarithmic scale. Because of that, that is a good indicator you've got the presence of a positive feedback dynamic. Another important problem with these major mitigation models is they are extremely complex. And the groups that are involved in putting together their analysis on these models are doing a Herculean task, a very difficult task of having to keep these models up to date because they are such huge models. The problem with that is that it takes so long to put out a new version of these models that they become out of date very quickly. This is a graph of all the different integrated assessment models projections of solar PV in China through to 2050, the most recent versions of the IPCC, AR5. And these in the stars are the actual cost declines through time. And you can see that very quickly the costs of PV went much lower than a lot of the projections. What is most difficult is the fact that the current cost of solar PV is already below what the projections have the cost at in 2050. So you can imagine that their models will include a lot less solar because of this than they should. Now, is there a better way of doing this? Is there a better perspective? We would argue there is. You might wonder, well, how can you possibly be able to come up with a way of forecasting technologies? They are such complex beings, and technological progress is not something that you can understand well enough to be able to project into the future. That may be true about new technologies, but once a technology becomes established, they actually seem to move on fairly consistent trends. You can see here the data from US manufacturing from 1958 to 2011 of a number of different technologies. Most of those technologies, as you can see, the the majority of them sit around this bell curve, which is close to around zero reduction in price, inflation adjusted through time. So most technologies don't actually reduce in cost through time, but there are some outliers, and we are very familiar with the fact that electronic computing devices have come down dramatically in costs through time. So that's one point, is that there is differences between technologies. Now, what empirical laws can we potentially use to understand these trends? One you are possibly familiar with in the world of computing is Moore's law, which looks at those trends through time. In this case, he was looking at transistor counts on computer chips, and the obvious implications that has for cost declines being also consistently declining through time. An alternative and actually older law is Wright's law, which looks at similar trends, but from the point of view of cumulative production. So instead of time being on the x-axis, you have cumulative production. And as he saw when he looked at, this is Paul Theodore Wright back in 1936, he was involved in building airplanes for the war effort. And he saw at a particular factory that prices declined with cumulative production. That has been tested against quite another number of technologies, both Moore's law and Wright's law. And you can see here with transistors in black, photovoltaics in red, hard drives in green, ethanol in blue, that both Moore's law and Wright's law do a relatively good job of following the trends in those technologies in terms of their cost declines, with Moore's law on the left through time on the x-axis, and in Wright's law on the right through cumulative production. We make use of Wright's law in particular because of the obvious implications for policy, that the more you invest in a certain technology, the more its costs can decline. The particular piece of work that I'm presenting here is based on around a decade's worth of investigation into these technology declines by Professor Doan Farmer's group at Oxford. They found that these trends are quite consistent, that they bundle across technologies. So you can see all the chemical technologies there in black have a fairly consistent decline, but are not a large decline. A much better decline for hardware, computing goods, and in particular genomics in the purple have a very steep decline. And they developed a methodology of applying Wright's law in a way to understand the uncertainty around those future projections based on Wright's law. So basically, they went back through time and looked at how well you could predict the next time point through all of the time points in the past. And from that, developed an umbrella of uncertainty around probability forecasts. And it's very important here that they have been able to apply uncertainty analysis to this so that you have an idea of that uncertainty. So you see those projections into the future having a standard deviation associated with them, a level of uncertainty associated with those projections. None of the IPCC models have this probabilistic forecast capability that gives you an understanding of the probability of a price declining through time. And we make full use of that in this analysis. There's a lot of math behind this that I will spare you, but it's important that you understand that we have something that's very different from the other models in terms of those probabilistic forecasts. That piece of work was done back in 2016, and you can see the green line dots of solar voltaic coming down through time to 2016. And the projections forward in the line and what actually happened. And you can see that what actually happened falls within that umbrella of uncertainty from their projections and actually did better than the global average trend at the time. You also might notice that nuclear in the red there, particularly in the West, has shown actually that the costs are not declining through time, although that is not necessarily the case, and we've seen some declines in the Asian nuclear market. So in order to understand the implications of these technological trends, we built a fairly simple, transparent energy system model. It encompasses about 90% of the energy system and the emissions from the energy system. It has all the fossil fuels, crude oil, coal and gas depicted, and then those used in end-use sectors such as transport, industry and buildings, as well as electricity generation that includes nuclear as well as wind and solar. Wind and solar are particularly important technologies for this modelling because of their experience curves and their trends through time, as are electrolyzers, which are important for the production of hydrogen, which is necessary for heavy goods vehicles, transport, shipping, and potentially long-term storage of energy on the electricity grid, as well as batteries, which are very important for short-term storage on electricity grids. Both of those are also have very good experience curves and trends that are declining through time. Actually, they are declining faster than wind and solar. And all four of those technologies are very important for this analysis. To do our analysis, we compared two somewhat similar transition scenarios: a business as usual stall transition, where you stop those trends in renewables through time and you maintain the current system in its actual energy mix, so mostly fossil fuels, and you have a 2% increase in energy demand through time. And from that, you can calculate the costs of having a system by 2070 that is fossil fuel based. You can also calculate the emissions, which we do. In contrast, we also have a decisive transition scenario that has meets the same energy demand, so has exactly the same economic growth, but instead it maintains current trends in renewable and storage technologies. It doesn't increase them, it just keeps those trends going as they are at their high rate of growth for the next decade. And then once renewables start to dominate the energy system, that growth relaxes off. To kind of simplify that and help you understand what that means, I'm contrasting our scenario, the decisive transition, to that of one of the International Energy Agency's scenarios, their more ambitious sustainable development scenario. So if you take their projections for 2019 in purple there, and you add that to all the other technologies, you get an energy mix that looks something like this. Blue is the electricity in the final energy mix. Fossil fuels are those below the grey line. And you can see that by 2040, this scenario has fossil fuels only producing about half of the energy system's energy demand. And with that, emissions have come down to about half of what they were by 2040. So progress towards meeting the Paris goals, but still some way to go. There is a bit of a trick in this scenario as well, in that they are using quite a bit of carbon capture and storage. So this scenario is likely to be more expensive than the current system. In contrast, if you take the solar PV trends that we see in the empirical record and you project them forward using the methodology that I've presented, you get a very different energy system by 2040. solar, wind, electrolyzers, batteries dominate fairly quickly. The trend stays flat for some time, the next 5 years as the deployment increases, but quite rapidly it dominates. By 2040. Fossil fuels are only supplying less than 20% of the final energy system, and emissions are rapidly declining in the energy system down to an alignment with the Paris Agreement. And most importantly, in our analysis, in terms of the engineering costs of the two systems, the decisive transition under all range of discount rates is actually cheaper than that stalled transition. So we should be doing this anyway. If you use a Stern review discount rate of 1.4%, we save 11 trillion by 2070. And what does that mean in terms of the IPC scenarios? As I said, the range of scenarios that are provided by the IPCC are quite extensive. Our stalled transition looks very similar to the IPCC's worst case scenario, but it also has the same level of economic growth associated with that scenario. Our decisive transition does not make it down to the Paris-aligned agreement, but that's mainly because of non-energy system emissions. Also note that our energy transition does not require economic growth reductions. So our two scenarios have exactly the same energy and economic growth. In contrast, the IPCC scenarios have a reduction in economic growth, a reduction in energy use, an enormous amount of carbon capture and storage, and electricity prices are likely to be higher because of it. In contrast, our decisive transition makes this reduction happen without any reduction in economic growth or energy use. That's not to say that efficiency measures are not important. They're extremely important. They will be a cheaper solution again. So our scenario could actually be even cheaper with energy efficiency. We don't use carbon capture and storage, but once again, because of those hard to abate sectors like agriculture, you will still probably need carbon capture and storage to meet the Paris Agreement for the non-energy system. But because you're not using carbon capture and storage, and because you're making use of the cost declines of these renewable and storage technologies, you will actually end up most likely with electricity prices much lower than they currently are, which you can imagine will do a lot for the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, you might be wondering, what does that mean for China and the regional differences that each country experiences? There are profound differences between each of the different countries. As you can see, China and India there have some of the lower costs of solar. United States is around the global average, but some countries like Russia and Japan have costs that are 3 times that of China and India. But what is most important to understand is those countries where it is the most expensive, the cost declines happen for everyone. The learning by doing is global. The knowledge we gain is global. And within 10 years, those costs in Japan and Russia will be, if they stay on the current trend, will be as low as China and India just in 10 years. And that means countries like United States will have their cheapest form of fossil fuel, which in the US is gas, surpassed by solar and wind within the next 5 years. And similarly for China, that is happening right now. You are getting costs in various provinces for solar and wind that are less than your cheapest fossil fuel, which is coal. And once those two countries start investing more in these technologies, I think you'll see those trends continually on a fairly runaway solution to climate change. So in conclusion, there's an opportunity for us to change the mood music that is being played to decision makers around the costs of the transition to a clean energy future. So resolute investment in key renewable and storage technologies over the next decade will help put us on track to meet our Paris goals, could cost trillions less than the business as usual, need not reduce our economic prosperity. In fact, because it makes electricity cheaper for everyone, we could actually see green prosperity, a new green industrial revolution. The original industrial revolution was on the back of cheap energy from fossil fuels. The cheap energy from renewables will be even cheaper. So you can imagine the prosperity that will bring. So COP26 offers us an opportunity for decisive action that could pay huge dividends for the world. I'd like to thank Professor Teng Fei and his team at Tsinghua for their help on this report, and Chatham House and the Foreign Office. If you are interested in this, there is a Chinese version of the summary for policymakers available on the energychallenge.info website. And thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And if our audience have any question, you can give your question in the question and answer channel. And at the end of this session, we will have the opportunity to ask our presenters to give some response. By saying that, our next speaker is Dr. Feng Aiqing from National Climate Center. Aiqing, you have the floor.
各位专家学者，大家好，我是国家气候中心的冯爱
Dear
清。
experts, dear scholars, I'm Feng Aiqing from the National Climate Center. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. I will continue my presentation. It's my great honor to share with you what our team has done and achieved in identifying the direct risks of climate change in China. Next slide, please.
So today I will talk about the three major issues. Next slide, please. Including the scientific facts of climate change and the climate change risks and patterns in key areas, as well as the typical area climate change risks. And we know the current society has experienced different development stages ever since industrialization. The society has greatly been affected by climate change. So from the 20th century to the 21st century, a lot of research results shows that we need to have a scientific understanding of climate change, and the comprehensive analysis of global climate observation data confirms that the global average temperature shows a significant upward trend, and the global average surface temperature in 2020 is about 1.2 degrees higher than the pre-industrial level. So we are understanding climate change in a more scientific way, and we also are trying to build up the eco-civilization, that is to try to achieve green and low carbon development. Next slide. Climate change, what kind of impact and risks climate change may have on the Earth? And according to the data, 2020 is one of the three hottest years on record. And the past 6 years, from 2015 to 2020, are the hottest 6 years on record. And so at the same time, the rising trend of sea level is accelerating. Since 1993, the average global sea level rise rate has reached 3.3 millimeters per year. Ocean heat content and ocean acidification are increasing, weakening the ocean's ability to mitigate climate change. The Arctic sea ice rapidly melted and became the epicenter of a climate change. In September 2020, the smallest sea ice extent in the Arctic reached the second lowest value on record. And in the past year, we have witnessed the frequent occurrence of many extreme events. We have the hurricanes, extreme heat waves, severe droughts, and wildfires have caused tens of billions of dollars losses in economy and many deaths. Disasters overlap each other and have a wide range of adverse effects, and it has affected people's health and well-being. Next slide. So now let's look at the relationship between risks and temperature rise. So compared with the pre-industrial temperature rise of 1 degree or 2 degrees, the global risk is at a medium to high risk level, while a temperature rise of 4 degrees or higher will be at a high or very high risk level. Among them, the key risks faced by Asia are mainly reflected in the increase in rivers, oceans, and urban floods. Next slide. Our research results shows that under different warming thresholds, extreme warming events in China will increase in the future, and there are more days of a high temperature. So on the slide, on the left charts are the extreme weather events, and on the right, this is the extreme rainfall events. Research results shows that in the RCP 2.6 scenario, when the global warming is 1.5 degrees, the number of sustained high temperature days in China will increase, and the number of extreme low temperature days will increase more significantly than that of the extreme high temperature. The numbers of extreme precipitation is frequent, but continuous dry period has shown an increasing trend in southern China. And the flooding events in 2020 in south part of China, and also in 2021 this year, the south part of China is having the droughts. So we can see that there are really a lot of extreme events recently in China and also the world. And in China, the risks of water resources show mainly are that the future climate change will sharply reduce the water resources of China's Yellow River, Haihe River, and Liaohe River, and increase the pressure on water resource. The flood risk of southern rivers, such as the Yangtze River and Pearl River, will increase, and the floods and droughts in China may become more serious in the future. And the water resources in arid and semi-arid regions are more sensitive to climate change than humid and semi-humid regions. Next slide, please. Next slide. And in the area of agriculture, the major impact and the risks are the layout of crops in China has changed. The area suitable for planting has expanded, and the warming of a growing season has resulted in the shortening of the growth period of China's main food crops and the advancement of key growth stages. And climate change has also caused extreme weather to occur more frequently. So these are the major challenges for the agriculture sector in China. Next slide, slide 9. So in the past several years, as the ocean sea level is increasing, the sea level rise has increased the erosion of estuaries and coasts, resulting in soil salinization and adverse effects on coastal wetland habitats. And the sea level rise superimposed on typhoon storm surge, which exacerbated the risk of flood disasters in coastal cities. The sea level will continue to rise in the future, and the return period of the current once-in-a-100-year extreme water level in many coastal areas will be significantly shortened. The risk of flooding is outstanding. The Yangtze River Delta, Beijing, Tianjin, Hubei, and the Pearl River Delta regions. And next slide. So future climate change will change the pattern of a forest. Warming and drying will have prominent risks to forests, grasslands, deserts, and wetlands. The north and west regions has a warming and humidification trend. This is something that we are paying great attention to, and we have come up with some kind of a policy recommendations to the government. And the wildlife animals and endangered species, they are suffering these smaller habitat areas. And typical marine ecosystems like mangroves, coral reefs, estuaries, and other ecosystems have obvious changes, showing high vulnerabilities and risks to climate change. Climate change will threaten the security and the sustainable development of China's ecosystem. And according to our analysis, so in the next 30 years, the total value of China's forest ecosystem services will increase by 15.7%, 18% in the next 3 decades. And the growth rate in the East will be greater than that in the West. Next slide. And China is very sensitive to the climate change, and different areas are different in this area. And according to our studies, so climate change is having more negative impact in China. So on the slide on the right, this is the risk map in China. With that, we can know different kind of risks in different areas in different parts of the nation. And in terms of the ecosystems, the water resources is having a greater problems in the northern part of the country. And so water resources, agriculture, this is the major risks for northern China. Northeast, the problems are water resources, agriculture, and human and health. And the transportation and energy risk is huge in central part of the country. And also in South China, the problem is traffic, energy, livelihoods, and human health. And in northwestern part of China, water resources, ecosystem, tourism, traffic, energy, they are the major risks. In Southwest, agriculture, tourism, and traffic, these are the major risks. Because the agriculture can be affected by the shortage of the water. And in terms of the major projects and the biological projects and road and also water conservancy projects, they may also suffer great negative impacts as a result. And our team has also cooperated with the Guangdong, Hong Kong, and Macau Greater Bay Area. So we studied the risks in the Hong Kong, Macau, and Guangdong Greater Bay Area, and we found that so in the scenario of RCP 4.5, the events of extreme high temperature and precipitation will also increase. And the maximum increase in the number of high temperature days can exceed 30 days and 25 days. The largest increase is located in the central area of the Greater Bay Area, major in Guangzhou and Dongguan. Next slide. Slide 13. Slide 13. So the index of heavy precipitation increased in most areas of the Greater Bay Area. So the number of rainstorms days and the maximum of 5 consecutive days of precipitation and the maximum increase of extreme precipitation were above 2 days, 30 millimeters and 100 millimeters respectively. 14, slide 14. And in terms of vulnerability, so based on the RCP 4.5 and SSP2 social economic path, and so And we understand that in the future, the GDP exposure to high temperature disasters will increase, and the exposure will reach its peak in the late 21st century. And according to our understanding, so the high temperature and the flooding areas are largely located in the red areas, the Guangdong, the west part of Guangdong, and the flooding, the highest risk areas of flooding is concentrated in Guangzhou, Foshan, Dongguan, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and Zhongshan, north of Zhongshan. So this is my introduction because I cannot share my screen. So probably what I am talking about is not completely matching the slides on the screen. Thank you very much.
Dr. Aiqing. And then the next presenter will be myself. The topic I will present today is on how to value and monetize the climate change damage in China. And this is also a research output funded by the UK-China Joint Project. Firstly, as you may know from the previous speakers, that the reason that we concern climate change is mainly because of the substantial impacts due to the climate change on the ecosystem and the social economic system, and also the substantial damage that to the economy and also the human society. And one example is the sea level rise. This is a recent study to show how the sea level rise will impact the mega cities in China, especially, for example, this is a study to present what is impact on Shanghai under various scenarios. You can see that a large part of the Shanghai city has been flooded around year 2100, and that will lead to tremendous economic loss in China. And so, as you may know from the previous speakers, that we are in a climate casino. We are gaming with the climate impact, and how to deal with climate change is basically a risk management perspective. And the main logic of this study is to use the risk management to understand how China that can reduce its carbon emission, and also that to cope with climate change. So by saying that, I would like to highlight that this cost-benefit analysis is very much important from this perspective. On the two sides of this balance, one is the cost, the mitigation cost, or the cost to reduce greenhouse gas emission. Or another side is the climate impact. If we can deal with climate change, then we can avoid those losses, and which can be regarded as the benefit. So the basic principle for climate change, generally how those cost-benefit analysis can help us to understand the climate goals. And generally in the studies, there are two types of damage function, which can translate the climate impact into the economic impact. The climate damage, the climate impact you have learned from the previous speakers, which mainly including those impact from a climate perspective, but how to translate those physical impact into a monetary term, that is one of the major things that we are doing. We basically use a model called integrated assessment model to translate those climate impact into economic impact. We link the three models. One is the economics model, which generate greenhouse gas emission, and then that emission drive the climate model to generate the temperature, and and also other climate response, such as sea level rise. And those climate response will be translated into a damage model and to translate those climate impact into economic impact. And then those economic impact will be introduced in the energy economic model to understand the system impact of the climate change. So that basically is the method we used to understand this this linkage between the climate impact and also the economic impact. Generally, we use a CG model, which is a word CG model developed by Tsinghua and MIT, and we couple that CG model with a climate model, and we develop a set of damaged function to understand various climate impacts. And I will introduce them briefly one by one. The first we consider is agriculture, which is generally to translate the temperature and also the temperature increase into the impact on the agriculture production change. That means given the temperature rise, what is the impact on the global agriculture output? And then we use that to drive the economic model to introduce the impact from various temperature goals. And another areas we are looking is the sea level rise. We consider to use those functions to see how the different level of sea level rise impact the capital loss in different areas of the world. And third level and the third category of climate damage we consider is the energy demand. The climate change, and especially the hot waves, will substantially increase the energy use for air conditioning. And then we use those functions to show the relationship between the temperature rise with the household energy demand consumptions, which not only in fact including the impact on the cooling energy demand, but also the heating energy demand. And the next is on the productivities. Because of the increased air temperature will have negative impacts on the labor productivity and also premature deaths. And we use this wet bubble global temperature as a proxy to estimate its impact on the productivity in various sectors. Given the increase of those temperatures, it will have different impact on the productivities in different sectors. And then we introduce that into our model. So that is basically that different damage functions we consider in this study. And also we consider is the future different scenarios. As previous speaker said, we used SSPs, which is IPCC scenarios to which covers various future of the world in terms of each climate change mitigation challenge and also the adaptation challenge. So that is the major result from our study. The first one is we show that economic loss due to climate change, which will achieve at least 2% to 4% of global GDP around 2100, which depends on the different scenarios, assumptions, but the range is generally between 2 to 4%. And if we translate that into the money term, which is generally ranged from 0.6 to $3.3 trillion. The reason for that is because of different scenarios assume different growth rate of the GDPs. So although the share of the GDP impact is quite similar, but the range of that overall economic loss is quite different. And the central scenarios is so-called SSV2, which is very close to our current economic development trend. And the economic impact under that scenario will be around 3% at the end of this century. But although that there is a 2% to 4% of global average impacts, but its distribution is quite uneven among different countries. And in this figure can show that those red region, which represent those region mostly impacted by climate change, mainly concentrated on developing countries, and especially India and Southeast Asia, which has the largest negative impact from the climate change. But although the developed countries also impacted by the climate change, but the level of the impact will be much lower than that of the developing countries. And for China, China is generally moderately affected by climate change. That means the extent of which China is impacted by climate change is quite similar to the world average. So for example, 3% under the SSP2 scenarios. And if we look at those different impacts on different sectors, generally we see that the agriculture sector is the most impacted sectors compared with others. And then the energy and also energy intensive sectors and service sectors also impacted differently. So the impact at sector level is also different under different scenarios. And if you look at China, we see that different with the world average also, the agriculture in China is less impacted compared with the world average. But for other sectors like service, energy, and energy intensive industries, its impact is quite similar to the world average. But that is only a vision from the media average. But if you look at those distributions, by understanding that, in fact, the future climate is uncertain, so the economic impact is also uncertain. And then we present this distribution of the possible climate impact on the China's economy and also the global economy. And you can see that the impact is quite wide. So the 2% or 3% only represent the average of the possible impact on China's economy. But in fact, there is a probability that China will suffer from a much higher impact. For example, if you look at that figures, there could be 1% for China to suffer about 7.5% GDP loss under the scenarios of SSP2. And also there could be a 5% of probability that China will suffer a 5% higher GDP loss. So we should not only consider the future's climate loss as a given number, but there is a distribution of those possible losses. That is another reason why we should consider the climate change from a risk management perspective. And we also compare with other mainstream IM models, and we found that our result is quite similar with what has been given under the other mainstream models. But if we look at those sector distribution, we found that the distribution is very much different among different models. That means we still need to improve our understanding on the sectoral level climate impact based on the existing literatures. And this is the figure to show that how the carbon neutrality target in China announced recently can avoid those climate benefits. In fact, we show that under the carbon neutrality target, which is quite in line with the Paris Agreement target goals of 1.5 degree and 2 degree, and then China can avoid more than $60 trillion of climate impact from 2020 to 2100 cumulatively. So that will be a huge benefit if China can achieve this carbon neutrality, which can avoid those negative impact on Chinese economy. And also we show that those relationship between the GDP loss with the temperature goal, and you can see that for China, there is a very there is a quite close relationship between the temperature go with the GDP loss. And as we have said that by achieving the carbon neutrality, and China can achieve a large amount of those climate impact by reducing those GDP loss due to the climate change on different sectors. So I will generally briefly summarize the preliminary findings from our study. Firstly, that the economic loss due to climate change generally will be around 2% to 4% for global GDP around 2100, or 0.6 to 3.6 trillion dollars at that time. And for China, that climate change may cost 3% of China's GDP around 2100. But the distribution of those climate change damage is uneven, largely concentrated in developing countries. So developing countries is most suffer from this climate change. But if you look at those climate damage, that the distribution of those damage is substantial. Although that our study shows an average of 3% for GDP loss in 2100, but there is also a small probability with a much higher impact. For example, probably 1% probability with rather than 10% of GDP loss. So that could be bring to the attention of the decision makers whether or not they can accept this risk to lose their 10% GDP with 1% probability, and that may change their sense on how to decide on much ambitious climate goals in the future. And also the much ambitious temporary goal will help not only China but also the world to avoid those climate damage. For example, if we can achieve the Paris Agreement goals, then for China that could benefit $62 trillion from year 2020 to year 2100 cumulatively. That will be a much larger benefit for Chinese policymakers to consider. So by saying that, we propose that the climate change should not only be considered as a temporary goal issues, but also should be considered from a risk management perspective that is generally about to what extent you can achieve a risk, a small probability, but a much higher impact risk. So by saying that, I will stop my presentation. Thank you very much. And then our next session will be the panel discussion. Today we have invited 4 very professional panelists. I'm sorry, 5. And I firstly invite Professor Zheng Yan from Chinese Academy of Social Science to give her comments on the topic today, and also maybe present some of her research on the on the indirect climate risk or system climate risk in China. Professor Zheng, you have the floor.
对，因为我觉得很有意思啊，就是那个谢谢那个唐教授，还有
This
谢
is
谢
a very
咱们
interesting
英国的
topic.
这个
I would like to thank
联
Professor
合
Teng
举
and
办这
also
次会
the
议。
Chatham House for
对不起
holding, and Tsinghua University for holding today's seminar.
我觉得这次会比较有意思的一点啊。
I think today's meeting is very interesting because it is open. It is open to the general public and those people who are not the insiders of the climate change community. I just now have read the questions in the Q&A box here, and I noticed some very interesting questions. For example, there are questions concerning the laws and regulations on the tax, on the carbon tax, to impose carbon tax in order to penalize those polluters. And some of the participants asked why we do not invite the speakers from the foreign countries. But I think this is a very good opportunity for us to talk about the climate change issue. And this is a very open seminar, and we have the simultaneous interpretation. So I have intended to speak English, but then later I found that there is interpretation, so I would like to use Mandarin. So this is an issue concerning whether you want more and more accurate kind of information. So for me, if I would like to hold a seminar, I will have the simultaneous interpreters to interpret for us. So this is the first point that I want to say. I want to say carbon neutrality was put forward by President Xi last year. Ever since that, it has turned out a very hot topic. I want to say for our institute, in the past, we were called the China Urban Environment Institute. So we studied urban planning and climate change. So I have studied the issue of climate change for more than a decade. And I have very close contact with the professors in this area, but I found there are not a lot of social science experts, but for the natural science experts, we more talk about the technology issue, but now we are more focusing on the human dimension. This is really good. China has made achievements in two important areas. First of all, we pay great attention to poverty alleviation. So this is about how to help the most poor and also the most vulnerable population. And also we prioritized eco-civilization. For our institute 1 year ago, we renamed our institute as the Institute of Ecological Civilization. Chinese Academy of Social Sciences is a national think tank. So basically, we are paying great efforts to support the study and research in area of ecological civilization. I know that you also have the team to study this area for about 20 years. So from the social science researchers' perspective, I want to share with you my understanding on carbon neutrality. Just now, Professor Dodadi and Professor Cheng Fei, they are very professional in terms of the climate risk assessment and the Austin Davis economic model. They are the top experts in this area in China. In particularly, as mentioned by Professor Cheng Fei, the global GDP losses can be 2 to 4%, and in China, that can be about 3%. So this is a very big percentage. Also, he has mentioned there is the regional differences, but in addition to that, the social science experts also pay attention to the differences among different populations. So Chinese President Xi Jinping paid much attention to the poverty alleviation. So China has preliminarily built ourselves into a moderately prosperous society. And in 2020, we basically have lifted all the people out of poverty. This is really very important. So this is about the intergenerational equality. And as to carbon neutrality, the Chinese government and the international community, they have injected a lot of the financial support in this area, and a lot of organizations are trying to get engaged because they see a lot of business opportunities. But in these years, so we have done a lot of studies and social surveys in cities, and we found people's assessment on risks, just like people's assessment on the quality of life. It is very subjective, but of course the issue itself is both subjective and objective. So I think the So once we determined the trend for the carbon neutrality for the social scientists on this very right and important pathway, we shall also do some studies concerning carbon equality. For example, we have some kind of new industries. Maybe we will close down the old factories or relocate the old factories. Maybe it will cause the employment losses and the investment losses. I want to tell you a story. So in a city in the western part of China, a very important prefecture level city, these years, it has developed very fast. It has very rich ecological resources. So it has developed maybe in not that green way. So for this city, it needs some kind of energy consuming industry. It has introduced some energy consuming industries from the eastern part of China. And recently, the central government has spotted out. So this turned out to be a very serious issue. We have cooperated with the city for more than 10 years. We have helped it to do the city planning and some policy formulation. So the city authority came to us and they said this industry indeed is very important. And this industry indeed has provided a lot of job opportunities because the city is not that rich itself. And for our experts, we have made it very clear that it's not possible that we will find some kind of reasons to justify you to continue this industry. We have to take resolute actions. You know, for the Chinese President Xi Jinping, we made these commitments. He or China make this kind of commitments. This is a strong commitment, and we know this is not something that we can do in a very easy way. We need to have the strong determination. Maybe in the short term, maybe it will sacrifice or compromise your local GDP, but in the long run, we have to consider the overall environment issue. And yes, indeed, maybe your local economy will be sacrificed. Indeed, there is the employment issue. And also for some population, probably they cannot find a job in the high-end industry. Indeed, they are the problems. So I'm telling the story to let you know that we still need to consider a lot of specific issues, and a carbon neutrality pathway sometimes it's not that positive because we have to take the costs as a result. And one of the participants has raised the question like whether or not China has this kind of laws and regulations. I think the developed countries, they have already developed the laws on climate change, but China has not. Several years ago, we had a draft legislation on climate change, but why it was not adopted? I think that's the reason. That is because of the system difference between the West and the East. And we will choose the most effective way for China. That is, we will take the administrative measures. And this measure is more effective and more efficient than legislation here in China. And the inspection from the Chinese government right now, it's a very effective way. Also, we have the one vote veto system. And we have incorporated the ecological civilization into the assessment of the performance of the local officials. I think this is really, really very strong measure. And I know for some government officials in Jiangsu province, they are very busy because they have to do that. Otherwise, they will be removed from the current position. So now in China, we're having the top-down kind of approach, and I know indeed this kind of approach is it's the advantage of China. So indeed, we do not have the legislation, but we're taking the administrative measures, and we are trying to realize the same goal. And I want to talk about the indirect risk of climate change. Now, just now, the previous speakers have talked about the direct risk, but now we are paying more and more attention to indirect risks. And not long ago, we had a China-UK climate change risk assessment. We have Chen Fei and the other organizations from both China and the UK have been engaged. And I believe I have benefited a lot from these projects because we are beginning to talk about the systematic risk of climate change. For the traditional economics, is now being discovered that it has a lot of shortcomings. If you have assumptions, then the traditional economics will give you a result, including the reduction of the GDP. But for the traditional economics, they just consider the rational economics. But there are also something like the behavior economics and also people's feelings. So what we're paying attention to currently is system risks in two areas. For example, urban regions, because urban regions have a lot of population and there are a lot of network infrastructure which are easily affected by the extreme weather conditions and will cause the chain reactions. So maybe one extreme weather event will paralyze the whole city. And also for the rural areas, in rural areas, the climate change may cause people to be back to the poor conditions once again. Although China has lifted most of the people out of the poverty, but I think we still need to consider the poverty issue because climate change may drag people back to the poverty. Another risk is the health risks. And I don't have to elaborate on that because this is well demonstrated by COVID-19. So it's really very hard for us to know the reasons of that because it is beyond our cognition boundary. So this is what I would like to share with you. I think today's conference is really interesting. I really hope that more and more social scientists can be engaged into this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tan. Hello, colleagues. My name is Wenjia Cai, and I work in the Department of Earth System Science in Tsinghua University. My background is climate economist, and I'm interested in modeling the health and economic impacts of climate action and inaction. I'm also the director of Lancet Countdown Regional Center for Asia, which sets up an independent monitoring system to track the health impacts of climate change and also the health co-benefits of climate actions. I think all the presentations today are very informative and enlightening. As all the previous speakers mentioned, a lot of countries, including China, have made up their determination to achieve carbon neutrality in the near future. And we also hear that it's not costly to achieve the 1.5 degree pathway. And if we fail to meet that target, we might have to encounter those dangerous risks from climate change, which also causes us a lot of money and other impact, like health impacts and the other impacts. And we also hear that we should regard climate change as a risk management perspective. And I really think all the key messages today are very important. So for the sake of time, I will only make one comment because today we have heard a lot of economic translation of the economics of climate change. But I think one important question we need to ask ourselves is, well, the financial cases shown by the previous presentations are so clear, and why do we still have this emission trend that seems to be going the opposite way? And if we look at the COVID recovery package, they don't seem as green as we expected. So why does that happen? One possible explanation is that I think we need to do more work to translate the good researchers' findings as we hear today to the language that the policymakers and public people can understand. Sometimes the message that we convey might be just too overwhelming for the common people to understand. And we might also need to focus on just probably one simple storyline, such as health, which becomes really a common attention after the pandemic. So that is just one observation. And well, if I may, I have another observation is that we can also distinguish those short-term and long-term effects or impacts, not only from the impact of climate change, but also the short and long-term impacts of addressing climate change. So, well, sometimes the policymakers, we can't blame them for being short-sighted, but if we could distinguish our impacts analysis into the short-term and long-term one, it might be easier and to catalyze their actions. So that would be my two observations. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chai. And our next communist is Professor Zhang from Wuhan University. And due to the time limits, if you can limit your comments within 2 or 3 minutes, that will be very helpful. Thank you.
谢谢各位那个分享嘉宾啊。
Thank you, the dear panelists. And I want to thank the 4 speakers for the excellent presentations. People are concerned about climate change, and we want to pursue carbon neutrality. We have considered the risks, but I think we have to pay more attention to the risks related to transition. In the climate change community and the carbon community, I think we have to pay more attention to transition-related risks. In the first presentation, the speaker mentioned that renewable energy cost is declining rapidly. That's true, but that has created some risks related to transition. We often talk about climate change risks. During the noon time, we can generate a lot of power from solar. That we can provide enough power during the peak hours in China and India. And there is a lot of installed capacity of solar PV and other renewable energy. But this has driven down the operational efficiency of coal-fired power plants. And the overall power generation hours of coal-fired power plants are driven down. So this is one possible transition-related risk. Maybe emission is not going down due to that. On the contrary, it may go up. So I think we have to pay attention to these transition-related risks. That's all from me. And Professor Teng, is that okay?
Time. And our next speaker is Professor Liu Qiyong from China CDC. Professor Liu, you have the floor.
Okay, great. Thank you. 今天非常荣幸参加这个会议，我也是。
It's my great honor to attend this important event.
这个声音啊听不到，还是看了一些报告。
I read some presentations, although I couldn't hear the speakers. As a healthcare worker or a person engaged in the healthcare industry, I want to talk about our decarbonization efforts and carbon neutrality efforts from the healthcare perspective. I want to talk about the policy implementations and some forecasts and estimates. There is one issue of a common concern and interest in the healthcare industry. People are interested in the overall impact of carbon neutrality policies and climate mitigation on healthcare. people think that, generally speaking, it is positive development to healthcare. It's a pity that I haven't got any estimates or evaluations about healthcare related impact from those emission mitigation efforts and carbon neutrality efforts. If there are researches on the healthcare impact from those efforts, I think we can mobilize more people to be engaged in carbon neutrality efforts. Everything has two sides. In the low carbon transition process and in the process towards carbon neutrality, I wonder whether there are some health-related risks that we have to pay attention to when policies and plans are being devised. And maybe if those healthcare-related risks are identified, they can better inform the policy makers. China is now developing the 2035 strategic plan and the long-term plan up to 2060. We have to identify the response in the healthcare sector. Next is about policy implementation and its impact on healthcare facilities, because this is an issue of public health security. These are just some of the questions in my mind. That's all from me. Thank you.
Our last discussion is Antony Forget from Chatham House. Antony, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. And thanks to all the speakers. It's been really interesting conversations across a broad range of topics. I think for me, I'd just like to say that obviously this year is a key year in terms of global climate change. We have the COP26 taking place in Glasgow in November. And many countries, including the UK and the EU, have been increasing their ambition in terms of climate mitigation in the same way that China has in terms of announcing its 2060 carbon neutrality target and its peaking target for emissions before 2030. And we saw that in April at the Climate Leaders Summit organized by President Biden, where a number of other countries made announcements. So the US announced that it would decrease its emissions between 50 and 52% by 2030. Japan increased its pledge. And as I said, the UK has already put in place has suggested a target that it will decrease its emissions by 68% by 2030. The EU, 55% by 2030. So we can see that over this year, we have increased ambition. Unfortunately, if you add all of these up, it's still not enough. If we carry on under the current scenarios, even these revised scenarios, then global emissions will probably rise above 2 degrees. So what we need to do is move further and faster. And I take from today's discussion, the presentation by Dr. Ives and Professor Teng Fei, is the opportunity to do this is clearer. And the consequence of not doing so is even clearer. So I do think the next 6 months are crucial. As I mentioned, we have the COP, the UNFCCC COP in November in the UK. Of course, we also have the Conference on Biodiversity being hosted by China. And there is many similarities between the two in terms of nature-based solutions. And so I hope that all of us in terms of the panel and all the attendees take some of the lessons learned from today's excellent seminar. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Antony. And also I would like to thanks again for all those presenters and panelists. As Antony has said that this year is a very critical year, that we need to increase our ambitions to achieve the Paris goal. We need to close this mitigation gap and also the financial gap to make the COP26 a success. And at the same time, we also need to make sure that we walk faster but more steady. That means, as our panelists suggest, we also need to consider this transition risk and also those public health infrastructure, what this means for different countries, and also the linkage between short-term and long-term transition. I think all of those suggestions are very helpful to make sure that in the acceleration of the transition, we can deal with those barriers in front of us, and finally to deliver ambitious target for all countries, which is workable within our countries and also implementable at global level. So by saying that, I'd like to thank again for our speakers and panelists for their very informative and a very insightful discussion and comments today. And by saying that, I would like to close this session, and also I'd like to thank you again for our for our interpreters and our patient audience. I hope you enjoy your work days and also your evening and also your afternoon. Thank you again.